In this video we'll be covering the first part of learning theories, which is classical conditioning. Well, this is the first learning theory that was really created, and it's also probably one of the most important ones to get your head around, and hopefully we're going to make this fairly simple. We're going to cover the classical conditioning itself and then some issues surrounding it. But first, it's a good idea just to run through an introduction very briefly to learning. And we need to know that learning's not memory, it's not just that, but there's a close link with memory, and that it's a process, and this process through which experience modifies our existing behaviour and our understanding. And there's two main types. The first one, the one that we're going to cover here, classical conditioning, which we can think of as, if this happens, I will do this. The second one being operant conditioning, meaning if I do this, this will happen. So in the first one, classical conditioning, our environment exerts an effect upon us which causes us to learn. In the other way, we do something to our environment and we learn from what we have done to that environment, the effect we have had upon the environment. So in some ways, classical conditioning is more of a passive learning experience and operant more active. Before we move on to classical conditioning, let's just think about this concept known as habituation. Now, this is a very simple concept to get our head around because it's the simplest type of learning and is thought of just as getting used to a stimulus. An example that we might choose from our clinical practice is the glabellar tap, where we tap on the forehead and get a blink response. And then gradually, over time, that blink response will decrease as we continue tapping until it goes away entirely. Or think about a soldier on a field of battle. Hearing a sound like this would be very shocking, quite terrifying, but subsequent times that response would decrease and they would have got used to that sound and be able to function in that battle environment. Now, here's a thing that for many doctors would cause a surge of adrenaline and this strong adrenaline response for anyone who is dealing with this patient. Now, for a general member of the public, there'd be no response to that. What's happened is that our doctor has been classically conditioned to associate this with a very negative outcome for the patient, and that's why they're getting that response, that need to do it. So they've built an association and they've learnt, and that's why they have a response to it. It was Pavlov who came up with the concept of classical conditioning during the course of some research he was doing about salivation in dogs, not related to learning at all. And you'll see just in this bit here, he's wired up something so he can measure the amount of salivation produced by the dog. Now, an interesting thing happened during the course of his experimentation. He found that salivation increased whilst he was walking towards the dogs with their food. Now, not in the same room, they couldn't see or smell the food, but they could hear his footsteps as he walked down the corridor towards them. And that was what was causing the salivation. And that was the start of this, the fact that their association with the sound of his footsteps caused the response. He realized they'd learnt that that meant they were going to get food. So let's break that down into the theory and also the terms, because it's really important to get your head around the different terms with these, partly because it's useful to know them, but also because they fit very quickly and easily into exam questions. Now, there's three phases to this classical conditioning. In the first phase, we have meat and a salivating dog, and the meat has caused the dog to salivate. We call this meat powder an unconditioned stimulus, which causes an unconditioned response. Okay, so this bit is important to understand. It's unconditioned because we haven't induced any learning. The thing that induces the learning, that causes learning, we'll call that conditioned. So unconditioned stimulus resulting in an unconditioned response, an automatic unlearned response. Any dog, put meat in front of them, they'll start salivating. We have a totally separate thing, which is a tone, and that produces no response in a dog, no salivation. And we call this tone the neutral stimulus. Neutral because it does nothing. Let's move through to phase 2. We've got our tone. We pair it with the meat, which is our unconditioned stimulus. Now, this tone becomes very important in a moment. So, we combine a tone with meat, it still results in salivation, but the salivation is because of that meat, the unconditioned stimulus. Phase 3, take away the meat. Tone on its own results in salivation. This tone is now known as the conditioned stimulus because we have conditioned it to happen. Learning has taken place. This tone has an association with meat and produces a conditioned response. We have caused that response to happen. That's the learning. Let's summarize that. Start off with the first phase, an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Nothing there, just a perfectly normal reaction. Neutral stimulus doing nothing. Put the two together, we result in this perfectly normal response to the meat. Unconditioned response to this unconditioned stimulus. Now take away that meat, that unconditioned stimulus, and we've got a conditioned stimulus that results in a conditioned response of salivation. They salivate when they hear the tone. And that's it in summary. So, to prove to you that this is a real thing that happens in real life, though hopefully it doesn't seem too far-fetched, I did an experiment myself with cats. I paired a neutral stimulus, that sound, along with an unconditioned stimulus, tuna flakes, something that drives my cats absolutely wild, and I got an unconditioned response. Whenever you open a can of tuna, they get very excited and get salivating and noisy as well. And then what I did for the purposes of this video, I withdrew the tuna. There was no tuna present, and I just gave them that clicking sound, the neutral sound, which had become a conditioned stimulus. And too excited, and then shortly later very disappointed cats that there was no tuna to be found. They had learnt to associate that clicking sound, that now conditioned stimulus, with the tuna, and that's why we got that conditioned response of them running into the room. So what we're wondering is this effect permanent? Well, what we'll see is the acquisition phase is the increase in the strength of this conditioned response to salivation, for example. Now, if we stop pairing that conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus and stop putting the food there, then this response starts to decrease, and that's our extinction phase. Now, during this, if you start putting the two back together, the unconditioned and the conditioned, then it's going to get back up to that original strength really quickly, or whiz straight back up there very, very quickly. Far quicker than might have happened. It's not going to happen at that same rate as that. It will shoot up like that, much, much quicker. And that's the evidence that learning has taken place, and that's known as reconditioning. Now, let's imagine that we just waited right until extinction's run its course and we get no response whatsoever to that tone. Now we wait a period of time, that's this pause here, then we'll see something called spontaneous recovery, where we'll get it a response, and it'll be a much stronger response than we'd expect, and then gradually go into extinction. So for an example of spontaneous recovery, let's think about something for our own lives, like hearing a song that reminds you of a previous partner. Now at one point that song was a neutral stimulus. It meant nothing in particular to you, but it became associated with that partner of yours and brings up a strong emotional response. And if you hear it even years down the line, you might still experience that very strong emotional response because of that association with it, that learning. Another concept that's really important to wrap your head around is stimulus generalization. So let's use an example of our dogs and their salivation, and imagine that down here is the tone, and this is 1000 hertz. Now what stimulus generalization says is that the response that you'll get is not limited just to a 1000 hertz tone. You'll still get a response to a 950 hertz tone or a 1050 hertz tone. But it also says that that response will decrease the further you move away from that original stimulus. So the more the tone changes, the less of a response you will get. But stimulus generalization is not something that simply applies to animals, and a man called John Watson some time ago did a study on a baby called Little Albert on stimulus generalization, trying to get little Albert to fear certain things, and there's quite a powerful video around this one that I'm just going to show you.
To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise, one of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the Little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited.
So we'll move from stimulus generalization that we've just seen into something known as stimulus discrimination. And this is, well, let's take an example. If you or I saw this in the wild, we would get a very strong fear response, I would imagine. Very, very strong. However, that would probably not generalize through to something like this. We could discriminate between these two stimuli and we wouldn't get our fear response. So even though they have similar characteristics, we can discriminate and tell the difference between the two stimuli apart. Let's just talk about timing for a moment, because that is important when it comes to this. You can present the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus together in simultaneously pairing, or one in front of the other. Now, the least effective way of doing it is actually backwards pairing, and that is to combine the unconditioned stimulus, wait, and then give them the conditioned stimulus. That's not particularly successful. You'll get a response, but it's going to take a very long time to do it. So that's giving them the food and then ringing a bell afterwards. Well, not going to be terribly successful. Putting them together is okay, it's not too bad. That's the food plus the bell at the same time. But actually it's forward pairing that's the best. Give that bell, then you give the food, and that works the best. And they found that there's a couple of things that can affect conditioning apart from the different times you'll present a conditioned and unconditioned stimulus. One of them is predictability. The more predictable something is, the stronger the conditioned response. And then signal strength. So something like the brightness of a light or the loudness of a buzzer. And the brighter or louder it is, the stronger the response you'll get. Now, attention's another thing that's important. So let's use this example that I've found here of a man being struck by lightning. Now, he could go on to be fearful of several different things depending what he had his attention most focused on at the time when he's hit by the lightning. Now, will he be fearful of working in the lab at night, or chemicals perhaps, or white coats? Well, in this case it's nothing because he goes on to be the Flash, but most people would develop some generalized fear of something that was going on whilst they had that traumatic experience. And there's also a notion of something called biopreparedness. That's building a response that's based on some kind of innate thing inside them. Let me give you an example. Rats that are exposed to a neutral stimuli of light, a buzzer, and saccharin flavoured water, alongside a shock or being made nauseous. So that's the thing that might happen to them. They could get a shock or they could be made nauseous, will develop different conditioned responses. If they get a shock, they'll avoid the light and the buzzer, whilst those who are made nauseous will go on to avoid drinking the water. Higher order conditioning is something that looks a bit complicated, but in reality is pretty simple. In this situation, we're just using this conditioned response that we've seen from before of a tone as the conditioned stimulus. That is a conditioned stimulus. So we've conditioned that dog, that the tone results in salivation. So all we're going to do in this situation is we're trying to get that salivation, that conditioned response, to a different stimulus, like light. So we're using the tone in the place of the meat powder here, and going through the phases exactly the same way. The tone produces salivation, conditioned stimulus results in a conditioned response, and then the conditioned stimulus plus a neutral stimulus results in a conditioned response. We take away that tone and we get salivation. So a conditioned response. Higher order because we've already been through a round of conditioning. We're moving it on to the next. Let's talk about a chap called Volpe, who came up with a concept of reciprocal inhibition. And this was the theory that there are two opposing emotions. They can't be experienced at the same time. So you can't be anxious if you're relaxed. So one way to deal with feeling anxious is to induce a state of relaxation. So you can see how this has become common practice in our therapies and our practice. Mindfulness is very much based upon this, that you can't be having unpleasant experiences if you're having pleasant, relaxing experiences. And there's this other concept that's known as systematic desensitization. Sounds complicated, but actually break it down, and it's just saying that you're using a systematic process to remove these unpleasant emotions, in this case phobias usually, to desensitize a person. So what happens normally is you use it to treat a phobia, like a phobia of birds as we have here. We start with a very, very mild stimulus, such as even a picture of a bird, and then you might have a stuffed bird, then you might touch a stuffed bird, then you might be in the same room as a bird, and then you'll gradually do things that you can handle. So you'll be in the room and you'll be able to get this close, and then once you're comfortable with that, you'll go and you'll do something like this, just letting the bird touch you, and then gradually you get to the point where you move your way along until you're comfortable with the bird. But we move on to something known as flooding, which is the reverse concept of systematic desensitization, and again used in treating phobias, and a very different approach here. What happens is you take someone and you expose them to the fearful stimulus, and it's in a situation they can't escape from. And there's a theory that they will eventually become desensitized to it simply because they can't escape. So here we have a young girl who's terrified of dogs, and we throw her in an area she can't get away from these dogs, and eventually she stops being afraid of these dogs. The concept known as flooding. Well, it falls in and out of favour, and it's not a way I would want to have any of my phobias treated, but there are some evidence to suggest that it might work. Now, that's classical conditioning, largely covered, along with some other concepts that are useful to know. We'll go on to cover operant conditioning and some other bits and pieces in another video.